She gave him everything. And that was the torture. Most people who've heard this story think they know what happened. A beautiful goddess fell in love with a shipwrecked king. She kept him on her island. He missed his wife. She let him go. Everyone went home sad. That is not what happened. What Homer actually wrote, encoded in the original Greek, buried under 2,000 years of romanticism, describes something far more precise, far more calculated, and far more terrifying than a love story gone wrong. It describes the architecture of a psychological black site, and the warden who ran it for 7 unbroken years wasn't lovesick. She was methodical. Her name was Calypso, and the name itself was the first warning no one thought to translate. The ancient Greek verb is kalyptein, to cover, to conceal, to shroud. Homer used this same word in battle sequences when warriors were swallowed by death clouds. When soldiers fell and the darkness closed over their eyes, Homer wrote, "It covered him." That verb, her verb. Calypso is not a proper name in the way we think of names. It is a function. She is the shrouder. Her island, Ogygia, was not a paradise. It was an act of burial. And the man she buried there, Odysseus of Ithaca, survivor of the Trojan War, king, husband, father, the most cunning mortal who had ever lived, spent 7 years weeping on a beach, unable to die, unable to leave, unable to fully live. The question that every scholar has danced around for 3 millennia is not whether Odysseus suffered. He clearly did. The question is whether Calypso knew exactly what she was doing. The evidence suggests she did. To understand the weapon, you first have to understand the location. Homer calls Ogygia the omphalos thalasses, the navel of the sea. Modern readers hear that and imagine a jewel at the center of the Mediterranean, some sun-warmed hub of activity. That is the wrong image entirely. In archaic Greek maritime cosmology, the navel of the sea was not a place of connection. It was an unreachable epicenter, equidistant from every shore, surrounded by the crushing, immeasurable weight of deep water. To be placed at the omphalos thalasses was to be dropped into the absolute center of a sensory vacuum, far beyond the trade routes of mortal men, beyond the navigation charts of gods, beyond the Pythagorean paths of the celestial bodies. It was a place so cosmologically peripheral that even the Olympian gods could barely see it. Hermes, the messenger god, the fastest thing in existence, described the journey to reach it as arduous. For a mortal without divine wings, the distance was simply infinite. This is not an accident of geography. It is a design choice. Modern isolation psychology has a term for environments engineered to prevent escape, not through physical barriers, but through sheer distance and inescapability. Isolated and confined environments. ICE. Researchers who study Antarctica stations, deep-sea submarines, and solitary confinement units have identified a core mechanism that all of these environments share. The subject is not held by walls. They are held by the mathematical reality that there is nowhere to go. The physical remoteness doesn't need guards. The distance is the guard. Ogygia was the ancient world's purest expression of this principle. Odysseus couldn't swim to freedom. The ocean was the cage, and the warden was born to build exactly this kind of cage. Calypso was the daughter of Atlas, the titan condemned to hold the pillars separating the earth from the sky, the god who personally maintained the architecture of cosmic division. She was not incidentally connected to the concept of separation. She was genetically constituted from it. Her father's function was to keep things apart that wanted to be together. Sky from earth, men from gods. And Calypso, inheriting that divine blueprint, built her domain to keep one very specific man apart from everything that gave his life meaning. His wife, his son, his kingdom, his mortality, his story. Every prisoner has a breaking point. Calypso's genius was understanding that the most durable prison is not the one that breaks you quickly, it's the one that makes you forget, slowly, that there was ever anything to break. The island Homer describes in Book 5 of the Odyssey is almost offensively beautiful. 4 crystalline springs flowing outward in different directions. A detail that matters because water flowing in multiple directions simultaneously means no current to follow, no downstream to trace, no navigable logic to exploit. The air was saturated with the sweet smoke of split cedar and citrus burning continuously in the hearth. Thick meadows of violets and wild parsley carpeted every surface. The birds nested in trees so dense and fragrant that even Hermes, a god who had seen everything, paused at the entrance and stood there for a moment, simply looking. It was extraordinary. It was precisely, deliberately, ingeniously extraordinary. The research term is aesthetic fatigue. Human cognitive systems are evolutionarily wired to engage with dynamic, changing environments. The brain is a prediction machine that requires novelty to stay functional. It needs seasons. It needs things to decay and regrow. It needs the surprise of a cold morning after a warm one, the threat of drought, the small urgency of a sudden storm. When an environment presents unbroken, perfect, unchanging beauty, without any requirement for survival-based problem-solving, the brain doesn't relax into it. It asphyxiates in it. The details that initially dazzled become oppressive background noise. The self begins to dissolve into the landscape. The boundaries between the prisoner and the prison blur until the prisoner stops noticing where one ends and the other begins. Ogygia had no seasons. The spring never ended. The flowers never wilted. The cedar burned forever and never ran low. For a mind adapted to the kinetic, brutal, consequence-laden world of the ancient Mediterranean, a mind that had spent 10 years fighting at Troy, and another season being shipwrecked and drowned and blown off course, this unbroken, sterile perfection was not a comfort. It was a chemical anesthetic applied directly to the survival instinct. But there was something else in those meadows, something Homer embedded in the botanical details that scholars have spent centuries cataloging without fully appreciating what they were describing. The meadows of Ogygia were thick with selenon and ion, wild parsley and violets. To a modern reader, these sound like garden decoration. To an archaic Greek audience, they were immediately, viscerally recognizable as something else entirely. Wild parsley was used to weave funeral wreaths. It was associated with the Nemean games, games that were funerary in origin, held in honor of the dead. Violets were linked to chthonic deities, to the underworld, to the decoration of tombs. Homer was not describing a paradise. He was describing a perfectly manicured cemetery. Odysseus spent 7 years breathing the scent of his own funeral arrangements, sleeping in a graveyard that never stopped being in bloom. The beauty was necro-aesthetic. The paradise was a tomb. And still, that was only the landscape. The real instrument of the black site was what happened every single day inside it. By day, Odysseus sat on the rocky beach, his eyes never dry. Homer writes it in Greek with a clinical, almost bureaucratic precision. Dakryophin tersonte, his eyes never ceasing from tears, staring out at the barren, unnavigable sea, grieving for his return. His nostos. In Greek, that word means more than just going home. It means the restoration of the self through return, the fulfillment of the story you were always supposed to be living. Every day on that shore, Odysseus could see exactly how impossible his nostos had become. The ocean was not an invitation. It was a wall. And the wall was so vast that it had no surface. You couldn't push against it. You couldn't measure it. You could only look at it and feel the looking drain something out of you, slowly, day by day, year by year. That's not loneliness. That's a designed psychological procedure. By night, Odysseus was brought back into the hollow cave, the speos, to sleep beside the goddess. Homer's Greek at this point becomes something that translates very poorly into the version of this story most people learn in school. The phrase is par uk ethelon ethelus, an unwilling man beside a willing goddess. Every word of that construction is precise. There is no ambiguity in the original text about the nature of this arrangement. The most powerful mortal in the world, a man who had survived everything the ancient world could throw at him, was reduced each night to a compliant object for an immortal entity who could not be refused, could not be overpowered, and could not be escaped. In modern forensic psychology, this pattern of alternating isolation and coercive intimacy, the engineered despair of the empty shore by day, the inescapable proximity by night, is classified as a systematic technique for the destruction of willpower. The subject is denied the ability to regulate their own stress responses. There is no baseline to return to. There is no moment of genuine safety. The captive's nervous system never fully activates its threat response because the threat is not discrete. It is total and environmental. And it never fully deactivates because the comfort offered at night is inseparable from the coercion that creates the need for it. Homer wrote this 3,000 years before the clinical literature existed to name what he was describing, which raises a question that the source material never directly addresses. Did Calypso understand what she was doing because she was cruel? Or did she understand it because she was lonely in a way that had already destroyed her from the inside, long before Odysseus arrived? We'll come back to that question. But first, you need to understand the final weapon, the one she hadn't used yet, the one she kept saving for when everything else started to fail. She hadn't offered him immortality yet. And that offer, when it finally came, was not a gift. It was the most elegant trap ever constructed in the ancient world. There is a specific kind of cruelty that only becomes visible when you understand what the victim values most. For Odysseus, it was not comfort. It was not safety. It was not even love. It was the right to have a story with an ending. Calypso understood this perfectly, and so her ultimate weapon was not pain. It was the removal of endings entirely. By the time the offer was made, and we don't know exactly when in the 7 years she first extended it, which is itself a detail worth sitting with, Odysseus was already a hollow version of the man who had walked out of Troy. The clinical term for what was happening to him is the systematic atrophy of purpose-driven cognition. When a mind is no longer required to hunt, to navigate, to strategize, to survive, those neural pathways begin to degrade. Not immediately, not overnight, but across months and then years of absolute comfort and absolute purposelessness, the machinery of a brilliant mind starts to seize. The war-hardened king was being slowly, gently, aesthetically reduced to a passive, weeping artifact of himself. Homer describes it in 3 words. Kate beto de glikis aion. His sweet life was draining away. That phrase is extraordinary in its compression. Not his life was ending. His sweet life was draining. Present continuous, an ongoing leakage. Not a wound, but a slow, imperceptible seep. The kind of loss you don't feel as loss because each individual moment of it is too small to register. It was against this backdrop, the weeping, the draining, the 7-year erasure that Calypso made her offer. She would make him athanatos kai ageraos, immortal and ageless. She would give him what the gods had, endless time, a body that never deteriorated, an existence beyond the reach of death. To a modern ear, this sounds like the most generous possible gift. We live in a culture obsessed with extending life, with defeating aging, with the fantasy that more time is always better than less. And so we read Calypso's offer and we think, why didn't he just say yes? The answer requires understanding something about the ancient Greek relationship to mortality that our culture has almost entirely lost. For an archaic Greek hero, death was not the opposite of meaning. Death was the engine of meaning. The brevity of a mortal life was not a flaw in the design. It was the design. It was the pressure that made action matter. Achilles, the greatest warrior of the Trojan War, was famously given a choice: a long, obscure life, or a short, violent one that would generate eternal kleos, eternal glory. He chose the short one, not because he was reckless, because he understood that the weight of an action is proportional to what it costs you. An immortal being performing a heroic deed is performing a calculation. A mortal being performing the same deed is spending something that can never be recovered. Odysseus's entire heroic identity was built on nostos, not kleos. He was not the man who burned brightest in battle. He was the man who endured everything, outsmarted everything, and found his way back to where he belonged. His heroism was explicitly rooted in return, in the restoration of his mortal identity as a king, a husband, a father. It was rooted in the knowledge that the journey had an ending, that there was a specific bed in a specific palace in Ithaca that was waiting for him. Carved from a living olive tree, permanent and immovable. That his son Telemachus was growing up in his absence and needed him to come home. If he accepted athanatos, deathlessness, from Calypso, none of that remained true. Not because the people in Ithaca would stop existing, but because he would stop being the person to whom they mattered. An immortal Odysseus in Ogygia was not Odysseus. He would become a nameless, ahistorical consort, a permanent decorative fixture in Calypso's domestic diorama. The siege of Troy, which had defined a decade of his life and the deaths of thousands of men, would be reduced to an anecdote. Penelope, the wife whose faithful waiting was already legendary, would age and die, while he remained preserved in amber on an island at the center of nowhere. His son would grow old and die. His kingdom would pass to someone else, and Odysseus would still be there, by the springs, in the meadows of funeral parsley, perfectly intact, perfectly meaningless. The offer of immortality was not a gift. It was a spiritual lobotomy. And this is where the research into Calypso's psychology reveals something that no Greek scholar seems to have wanted to say directly, because it complicates the story in a way that is deeply uncomfortable. Calypso knew exactly what she was offering. She was not confused about the nature of mortal heroism. She was the daughter of Atlas, a titan of immense cosmic sophistication. She had been watching mortals from the edge of the sea for longer than most civilizations had existed. She understood what nostos meant. She understood what the stripping away of mortality would cost a man like Odysseus. She understood that the offer was not salvation. It was the most elegant form of the prison she had already been constructing for 7 years. The refusal to accept the offer, Odysseus's repeated, agonized, daily refusal, was not merely a matter of missing his wife. It was an act of ontological self-defense. He was fighting with the only weapon available to him, to remain real. Every weeping hour on the shore was a form of resistance. The tears themselves were proof he still knew who he was. A man who has fully dissolved into his prison does not weep for what he lost. He forgets he ever had it. Odysseus never forgot. Here is the detail that historians tend to elide when they summarize this episode. Calypso had done this before. There is a shadow in the Homeric text, barely referenced, almost parenthetical, of another mortal man who had washed up on Ogygia before Odysseus. His name was Iasion. He was a lover of the goddess Demeter. He ended up dead, struck by a thunderbolt from Zeus. His presence in the mythological record is faint, ghost-like, as if he had been almost completely erased. Which, if you accept the clinical analysis of what Ogygia does to people, is precisely the expected outcome. Ogygia does not preserve mortals. It removes them from history entirely. Iasion is a man whose story was so thoroughly buried by the island that even the gods who killed him seem to have half forgotten he existed. Odysseus was not the first prisoner. He was just the one who managed not to disappear. And he managed it by accident, by one very specific, very stubborn psychological feature that Calypso's elaborate architecture had never fully been able to erode: his attachments to Penelope. Not romantic attachment in the way the story is usually framed, something more fundamental. Penelope represented the specific, embodied reality of the life he was supposed to be living. She was concrete proof that the world Calypso was slowly editing out of his memory was not a fantasy. She was a woman he had built something with, something real and complex and imperfect, and therefore alive in the way that Calypso's perfect island could never be. Every night in the Speos, lying unwillingly beside a goddess who would never age or scar or tire or die, Odysseus held Penelope in his mind like a man holding a coal in his bare fist. It burned. It kept him awake to himself. The clinical literature on extreme isolation describes a phenomenon where captives who maintain a vivid, specific internal relationship with a person outside the prison survive significantly better than those who do not. Not vague hope, not abstract longing. A specific person, a specific face, a specific detail, the texture of a voice, the way a person moves in a familiar room. The more concrete the interior relationship, the more durable the captive's sense of self. Odysseus kept Penelope so specifically in mind across 7 years of isolation that when Calypso finally, under divine compulsion, allowed him to leave, he took the tools she gave him and built a raft in 4 days. 4 days. A man who had spent 7 years in enforced leisure, whose practical skills had theoretically rusted to nothing, built a functioning ocean-going vessel in 4 days. That kind of speed is not natural competence returning. That is a man who had been rehearsing his departure in his mind every single day of his captivity. He had never stopped planning to leave. Which means, on some level, Calypso had never fully won. But the divine compulsion that finally freed him was not justice, or mercy, or the natural resolution of the situation. It was a bureaucratic order from Zeus, delivered by Hermes with the discomfort of a messenger who clearly did not relish the assignment. And the moment that order arrived on Ogygia, something happened to Calypso that changes everything about how this story should be understood. She shuddered. The Greek word is rigesen, and the narrator's job here is to make sure you understand exactly what that word means, because it is not the word Homer would have used for disappointment, or sadness, or even anger. Rigesen is the bone-deep somatic response to traumatic horror. Homer uses it in battle sequences when warriors suddenly understand they are about to face something they cannot survive. It is the shudder of a person who has just perceived their own destruction. It is fear in its most involuntary, most honest form. Calypso shuddered when she learned she had to let him go, and that shudder is the hinge on which this entire story turns. Here is the question nobody asks about this story. The question that rewrites everything if you sit with it long enough. If Calypso's island was a prison, and the evidence is overwhelming that it was, who was it built for? The easy answer is Odysseus. He was the one weeping on the shore. He was the one sleeping unwillingly in the cave. He was the one whose sweet life was draining away. But the easy answer stops just short of the thing Homer actually built into the story, buried in the final image of Book 5, in the moment after the raft disappears over the horizon, and the camera, so to speak, does not follow it. The camera stays on Calypso. She is a goddess. She cannot die. She cannot leave Ogygia, not because the island prevents her from leaving, but because she is the island. Her divine nature and Ogyggia's cosmic position are inseparable. The omphalos thalassas is not her address, it is her substance. She is made of the separation she embodies, just as her father is made of the architecture he holds up. When Odysseus's raft disappears into the dangerous, kinetic, mortal world, into the world where Poseidon is already gathering storms to drown him, where every moment carries consequence and every choice has weight, Calypso remains in the perfectly manicured chthonic meadow, beside the 4 symmetrical springs, under the dense cedar canopy that blocks out the sky, listening to the same waves she has listened to since before the Trojan War. She had weaponized the eternal spring against him. Now she would live inside it, without him. She had weaponized the aesthetic fatigue of unbroken beauty against him. Now she would endure it without the distraction of his grief. She had weaponized the selenon and ion, the funeral parsley and the underworld violets against him. Now they would bloom and never wilt around her for the rest of time. The prison she designed for him was the prison she already lived in. That is the structural irony at the core of this story, the one that changes everything if you let it. Calypso did not imprison Odysseus in a place different from her own existence. She imprisoned him in the exact coordinates of her own eternal confinement. The difference between them, for 7 years, was only this: she had company. When Hermes arrived with the order from Zeus, Calypso did not quietly accept it. She protested with genuine fury, delivering an indictment of the male gods who took mortal lovers with impunity, while goddesses who did the same were condemned for it. The speech is passionate, articulate, and substantively correct. The double standard she identifies is real. The hypocrisy is real. Dawn had a mortal lover named Orion, and the gods killed him. Demeter had a mortal lover named Iasion, and Zeus struck him with a thunderbolt. The divine patriarchy had a long and consistent history of policing female gods' relationships with mortal men, while the male gods pursued mortal women without consequence or comment. Calypso's argument was just, and it changed absolutely nothing. The order from Zeus stood. Hermes did not debate her. He simply repeated the order, wearing the expression of a bureaucrat who had been given an unpleasant errand and wanted it concluded. And then the shudder came. Rigesen. And Calypso knew she had lost. Not the argument. She had won the argument. She had lost the only thing that mattered. She went to Odysseus on the beach and told him he was free to go. He didn't believe her at first. 7 years of captivity does that. He made her swear an oath, the most binding oath available in the Greek universe, sworn on the waters of the Styx, that this was not another trap, that she wasn't sending him towards some worse suffering disguised as liberation, that the freedom being offered was real. She swore it. And the fact that she swore it, that she did not resist, did not negotiate, did not try to extend the captivity even one more day once the divine order was invoked, tells you something crucial about what Calypso actually was. She was not a monster. She was not a villain in the crude, cartoonish sense. She was an immortal entity of immense isolation, doing the only thing available to her, which was to fill the void. She fed him. Not the divine ambrosia she ate herself, which would have complicated the immortality question, but real, mortal food. Wine and bread. The food of the world he was returning to. She bathed him and dressed him in clean clothes that smelled of the island. And then, with a behavior that is almost unbearable to contemplate if you understand what her situation was, she went to the forest with him and helped him fell the trees for the raft. The sound of the bronze axe on the first tree would have been the first genuinely violent, kinetically consequential sound Ogygia had produced in 7 years. The sharp percussion of metal on wood, the crack and fall of an alder, the grunt of a mortal man performing hard physical labor. All of it shattering the pristine, metronomic silence of the springs and the waves and the endless burning cedar. Every stroke of that axe was a declaration that time was moving again, that things could be destroyed, that the stasis was breaking. For Odysseus, the sound was resurrection. For Calypso, it was something else. He worked for 4 days. She watched. By the 4th day, the raft was bound with pegs and fitted with mast and sail. She gave him provisions, water, wine, dried meat. She summoned a warm westerly wind to carry him toward the world. She stood on the shore as he pushed off into the water. Homer does not describe her expression at this moment. He describes Odysseus looking back at the island as it receded, and then looking forward, keeping his eyes on the Pleiades, finding his celestial navigation again, remembering how to use the stars. And Ogygia shrank behind him. Poseidon noticed. The god of the sea, who had long harbored fury against Odysseus, looked down from a distant mountain and saw the raft on the water and assembled his storms immediately. Within days, Odysseus was in the water, drowning, stripped of his raft, surviving only through the intervention of yet another divine entity, who took pity on him and gave him a veil that kept him afloat. The world he escaped into was brutal, kinetic, and immediately trying to kill him. He survived by the margin that the world's most cunning man always survives by, which is to say, barely, and through a combination of intelligence and extraordinary luck. But he was alive. He was moving. He was suffering consequences, which is another way of saying his actions had weight again. He was Odysseus again. Back on the island at the navel of the sea, Calypso listened to the same 4 springs. The cedar burned without diminishing. The violets held perfectly still in air that never moved. She would listen to those springs for centuries after Odysseus sailed into his legend and died in his bed in Ithaca beside the wife he had crossed the world to reach. She would be there while Troy became ruins, and the ruins became dirt, and the dirt became farmland, and the farmland became a country with a different name. She would be there while the stories of the Trojan War were written down and rewritten and translated and debated in libraries that were built and burned and rebuilt. She would be there as the very sea around her changed, the centuries depositing their silts and salts until the Mediterranean looked slightly different than it had when her father was young. She would always be there. Immortality, she had told Odysseus, was a gift. Deathlessness, agelessness, eternity of perfect form. She had been living inside that gift since before recorded history. She knew what it was. She had offered it to a mortal man in a moment that looked like generosity, but was, if you read it correctly, a moment of profound and desperate honesty. She was not trying to give him something wonderful. She was trying to give him a companion in her own specific condition. She was trying to make him understand the prison not by describing it, but by sealing him inside it permanently. The offer of immortality was not a trap. It was a confession. It was the admission, finally, of the thing that the entire 7-year captivity had been designed to conceal, that Calypso was not the warden. She had never been the warden. She was the longest-serving prisoner the cosmos had ever produced, condemned to an eternity of sterile perfection in a location so cosmologically peripheral that the gods themselves had to make an effort to find it, slowly hollowing out across infinite time in a prison she had inherited from the architecture of her father's punishment. Odysseus wept on the shore every day for 7 years because he couldn't leave. Calypso prepared his meals every day for 7 years because she couldn't die. They were performing grief in the same location for the same duration, and the only difference was that she knew the grief would never end for her, while he, at least, retained the hope that it might. Here is the thing about Ogygia that Homer embedded in the story but never stated directly. The piece that makes this more than a myth and more than a psychological case study. Every human being has some version of that island, an environment so familiar it has stopped being visible, a comfort so total it has become its own kind of suffocation. A relationship, a career, a belief system, a version of yourself that was safe and perfect and utterly without seasons, without the possibility of decay, without the productive friction of change. And the terrifying question that Calypso's story asks is not whether Odysseus was right to leave. Of course he was right to leave. The question is what happens to the part of you that you leave behind on the island. Because that part is still there. It always is. Perfectly preserved. Tending the eternal springs. Watching the horizon. Waiting for someone, anyone, to wash ashore and stay a while. The structural irony at the center of this entire story is not that Calypso was a villain who lost. It is that the greatest punishment in this narrative was distributed to the person who had done nothing wrong. Odysseus survived Ogygia because he was mortal. Because mortality gave him a deadline. Because his very fragility was the mechanism of his salvation. Calypso, the immortal, the powerful, the warden, was imprisoned by the same feature that made her powerful. She could not die. She could not leave. She could not change. The prison she had built and weaponized and refined over centuries was the exact shape of her own divine nature. Now ask yourself this. When Calypso offered Odysseus the gift of immortality, was she trying to trap him? Or was she, in the only way available to her, asking him to stay, not as a prisoner, but as the one companion who had ever, across all the long centuries of her existence, been real enough, stubborn enough, and specifically himself enough, to never fully disappear into the beautiful, suffocating, permanent silence of Ogygia. He chose to leave. He was right to choose it. He left a ghost behind him. That ghost is still out there, at the navel of the sea, where the water is very deep, and the cedars burn forever, and the violets never die, and there is no winter, ever, and the silence between the waves is so perfectly complete that you could mistake it, if you weren't paying close attention, for peace. There is a figure we have not yet accounted for in this story, a mortal man named Ixion, lover of the goddess Demeter, who appeared on Ogygia before Odysseus and was erased so completely from history that even his death barely registered. We do not know how long he was there. We do not know how much of him Ogygia consumed before Zeus's thunderbolt removed him from the equation. We do not know whether he too wept on the shore, or whether he was the one who taught Calypso the discipline of alternating despair and coercion, whether he was the one who proved to her, through his own dissolution, that the island could work. That story has never been told.